think we're going to be live very soon. Yeah, I think we are live.
We are. Great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment. My name is Ali Rizvi. I'm the author of The Atheist Muslim, and with me is Armin Navabi, who is the author of Why There Is No God and the founder of Atheist Republic. We are going to get right to it. We're thrilled today to have on the show Professor Steven Pinker. Professor Pinker is the Johnstone Professor of Psychology at Harvard. He's a fellow Canadian, like Armin and I, and he's the author of just a whole bunch of bestsellers, including The Better Angels of Our Nature, and most recently, Enlightenment Now, which Bill Gates has called my new favorite book of all time. And so he's joining us today. Professor, thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So we wanted to start with just talking about with the basics. Enlightenment. What do you mean by enlightenment? And can you just give a brief explanation of what it is for the audience?
I explain it in the subtitle of the book, Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. Reason, the idea that we have to base our actions on our best understanding of how the world works based on rationality and evidence, as opposed to dogma, scripture, charisma, sacred texts, hermeneutic parsing of ancient documents, subjective feeling of certainty or inspiration or revelation. Science, which is just the application of reason to understanding the physical world. Humanism, which is the moral stance that the ultimate moral value is the well-being of human beings and other sentient beings. So humanism is a little bit misleading in that it doesn't actually rule out the interests of animals, but we can start with humans, as opposed to the glory of the race or the faith or the nation, or advancing a set of divine commandments. So even though it sounds rather anodyne or trite to say that the flourishing of human beings is the ultimate moral value, it really is a distinct moral commitment. It is there actually is content to it. There is substance, and people disagree with it. Finally, progress, which is the idea that if we apply reason and science to advance human flourishing, we can gradually succeed over time if we learn from our mistakes, keep the things that work, discard the things that don't. Then it's possible that we can accumulate the solutions to problems and make life better. Now, the name Enlightenment, which has nothing to do with enlightenment in the Buddhist sense, comes from the fact that these ideas were really advanced in their most influential form in the second half of the 18th century, in the period sometimes called the Enlightenment.
So one of the things that we cover on this podcast is we talk about people from the Muslim world who are trying to bring about these changes in their society. So these are, and you mentioned some of them in your book. You had a section on the humanist movements and secular movements in the Muslim world, and some of the thought leaders that are currently leading it. One of them was
including you,
including me, and thank you
Yes.
for that. I appreciate that. We recently had Mariam Namazi, who you also mentioned in the book, on our podcast. And she's a founder of the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain, and she has witnessed this organization mushroom. It's starting in 2007 with just a handful of members, to now there are tens of thousands of members worldwide. She also told us, and I agree with this, she said that the internet is doing to Islam today what the printing press did to Christianity in the past. And so you wrote about how the Muslim world sat out the Enlightenment process largely a couple of centuries ago, and how Muslims, compared to Jews and Christians, tend to be more religious and take their scripture more literally than other religions. But do you think that a Muslim enlightenment, an enlightenment in the Muslim world, is possible now, considering how far we've come since the Salman Rushdie days a few decades ago?
Absolutely, which is not a prediction that it's going to happen anytime soon, but we can be surprised. But certainly in the long run, it's just hard to imagine that the Muslim world will stick with the various really medieval practices in a globalized world where ideas flow across borders, where the same forces that eroded ecclesiastical authority in the Christian world are operating today. And as you mentioned, the internet means that they're operating at even faster timescales. Also, there's a really significant generational turnover. If you look at changes in attitudes, particularly liberalization, by which I mean women's equality, tolerance of homosexuality, bringing up children to be autonomous and creative as opposed to obedient, favoring democratic participation in institutions. Every region in the world has shown an increase in these what are sometimes called emancipative values. That's a term from Christian Belzel of the World Values Survey. Now, there are big differences between regions. Not surprisingly, Western Europe is the most liberal, and the Middle East and North Africa the least liberal. But two really significant trends are happening. One of them is that they're all increasing over time, even though there are differences among the world's regions. The other is that the liberalization is more pronounced if you compare one generation with another than if you look at attitudes within a given generation over time. Now, both of them are becoming liberal, but the generational turnover is probably more profound, and it is happening in the Muslim world. So that I had to blink when I looked at this graph, because it seems incredible to believe, but the attitudes among young Muslims today are more, on average, are more liberal than attitudes in Sweden and the Netherlands in 1960. Now,
wow.
Now that might just seem, there's got to be an error there. But when you think about it, if you were to go back in a time machine and ask a Swedish gentleman in 1960, what do you think about the idea of two men getting married? You would have said, "Are you nuts? That's inconceivable. That's against nature. It's against Christianity. I'm Christian." So it reminds us that attitudes really do change, and I suspect there's a lot more even happening in more confidential private arenas than in the public arena, because there's also so much overt oppression.
Yeah.
So the name of the full name of this podcast is Secular Jihadists for a Muslim Enlightenment. So it's very fitting that we have you on, by the way. But the reason why we named it that way is because we're suggesting enlightenment as the solution to the Muslim world, and not the reform movement, and opposed to the reform movement. Because we think a lot of people, when they look at the Christian world and how maybe it's a little bit, the Enlightenment values became more popular there, we think it was because of the Enlightenment movement, not because of the reform movement. And we need something similar from in the Islamic world, which is a movement away from religion, not reflecting on religion. I mean, none of the values in the West that we call Enlightenment values, we think Christianity has any responsibility for. And I don't think we need to go back to ancient texts to find these values in the Islamic world. The young generation of Muslims that you're saying, they're also moving away from religion. Is that your understanding of what's going on?
Yeah, certainly one doesn't want the Islamic world to go through what the Christian world did during the Reformation, which was followed by the European wars of religion,
right.
Some of the bloodiest wars of all time, in some ways exceeding World War I in terms of the per capita deaths. And you had heretics on both sides being burned at the stake. Yeah, you're right. Certainly the Reformation is not the model to follow, and it's not Christianity. It is Enlightenment. Now, that having been said, there is, you know better than I, but a strategic question is, how do you promote these ideas in which the largest number of people can kind of get behind them and not just react instinctively? And for that, I don't know what combination of marketing terms is most effective. Certainly, let's copy the Christians. There are many reasons not to do it that way. One of which is that the Christians were intolerant, bloodthirsty, murderous, genocidal, and so on. So let's not do that again. So the question is, how in much of the Christian and Jewish world, there's a combination of overt humanist movements and overt atheist movements. And there's also a kind of benign hypocrisy, where people don't come out and actually say, I don't believe in God, because that's kind of a big leap for a lot of people, or I reject my religion. It's kind of, well, I don't know, there's some higher being, there's a spiritual presence, and you know, they're a little squishy on the details. They still go and they enjoy the rituals and the music and the architecture and the community and you know, general uplifting moral values. They call it their religion, but the religion itself has been so drained of supernatural, of dogma, of it's been itself so influenced by the Enlightenment that it's kind of transformed without always having overt announcements. You know, we're giving up God, we're giving up the religion. And so of course, am in no position to say what kind of sort of soft changes in benign hypocrisy might work, as opposed to a more in-your-face, let's figure out what we can defend and stick only with the propositions that can be rationally defended. And this is a question of just tactics, strategy. There's no question that the ideas are pretty clear. Namely, you really don't want to base morality on God, because God can say anything he wants. But how you market that in a way that people can, as many people as possible, can get on board, it's kind of a, you know, almost a PR question.
Right. Well, what happened, as you suggested, there's nothing within Christianity or Islam that is responsible for those Enlightenment values. It's if we're trying to be nice, we could just promote the Enlightenment values rather than as it is, because within the way you mentioned Christianity, Christians change. There was nothing within Scripture that made Christians change.
Yeah.
Right? It was basically being challenged by other ideas. Actually, Sam Harris recently mentioned in Vancouver in his debate with Jordan Peterson, religious doors don't open from the inside; they are kicked in from the outside, right? So, So I'm not suggesting. Well, yeah, go on.
I mean, I think it might be a mixture, just because the people with it starts to get. As the world modernizes and as Enlightenment values spread, certain ideas from within the religion just start to feel uncomfortable even from within. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The Mormon Church in the United States, which started off as a kind of a you know, a nut cult, but it became, over the years, as it became more established, more woven into business and community and governance, they kind of had to change with the times. So my favorite two examples are that when the state of Utah, which is where Mormonism was concentrated, wanted admission to the Union, to the United States, to be kind of promoted from territory to state. Then this embarrassing thing of, you know, polygamy. And, you know, the U.S. was just not going to admit a polygamous state, and that was part of the sacrament of the church. Well, all suddenly, the church elders had a revelation. Amazingly, polygamy was not okay. And, you know, God spoke just in time for Utah to be admitted to the Union. And then again in the 1960s, African Americans could not be ordained as Mormon priests or ministers. This started to feel a little embarrassing, and so they had another revelation that, I forget whether it was that they bore the mark of Cain, or there was some theological mumbo-jumbo that relegated blacks to second-class citizens, which suddenly was erased just in time for the civil rights movement. So it wasn't as if people, I don't know the details of the history. I don't know if there was like a protest movement that kicked down the doors of Mormonism, or whether they were just kind of sensitive enough to changing values and changing ideas that they knew that they had to reform from within.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and what we talk about a lot here is that we make this distinction in the case of Islam between Islam and Muslims, for instance. So Islam is, you know, like if you look at the Old Testament or if you look at the Torah, it's a very, very brutal book. Yeah. But Jews, on the other hand, if you look at Reform Judaism, that has completely changed from when Judaism started, where there was adherence to sort of literal scriptural reading. So,
that's even true in Orthodox Judaism. It's thanks in part to the fact that the Talmud has kind of superseded the Torah, and so a lot of the bloodthirsty passages from the Torah are kind of, you know, soft pedal. They're allegorized. Well, they didn't really mean it literally. It was so it's I think it's a combination of the kind of the intellectualized, argument-based approach that the three of us take, Then at the same time, in a kind of surround, there's also got to be probably some soft, gradual changes, some benign hypocrisy, some things that people don't, they can't quite come out and actually say things, but they change what they actually do.
Right. They get in the room, at least.
Like, they get in the room, exactly. And then the ideas are available for those who are ready to completely think things through and have a consistent set of beliefs. So they're out there and they're articulated. The thing is that the vast majority of humanity doesn't actually live by a logically consistent set of propositions. I mean, our belief system's got contradictions all over the place, and we kind of live with it because we don't think about it too deeply. At least a large number of people don't. And so part of the strategic plan is how do you get that mass of people who don't really care about complete logical consistency to at least stop, murdering apostates.
Mm-hmm. So that actually brings me. I had this next question. I think you set it up perfectly. Is that as you said, all three of us would like to hope that facts and logic can persuade, but as you said, this may not be the case for most people. They may need something else, other persuasive tactics, as you mentioned. So people have found storytelling and appeals to emotion, using tools like art, and much more compelling when you look at it historically. So religion is successful because of this. Christianity has sculpture, painting, music like gospel choirs. Islam has calligraphy, poetry, the prayer call, the recitation of the Quran in a musical way. So is there a place for us in the secular movement or the Enlightenment movement to use the same kind of media, the appeal to storytelling and emotion, but do it with science and reason, and do it in an honest, truthful way? I know Richard Dawkins does this. He talks about the awe of the universe. Carl Sagan used to do it with storytelling. And is that something that may be missing in the secular movement when we talk about, just logic and facts and just cerebral arguments?
I think there has to be. I don't know if there's a formula or an algorithm for making that happen, for appealing to people's intuitions and habits as well as their rational side. But yes, certainly they did it, and possibly what we don't really understand in terms of large historical changes is all the different channels by which a change is pushed along. Another factor that has been credited with advancing the Enlightenment is the spread of accessible fiction and literature, where there are protagonists, unlike oneself, that one empathizes with just because you absorb yourself into the story. And according to one historian, Lynn Hunt, that was one of the forces behind the humanitarian revolution, which was basically another word for the Enlightenment, when cruel, sadistic punishments were outlawed, and slavery and capital punishment for hundreds of trivial crimes. Now, we don't really know how much the novel itself really pushed that along, but it may have been one of the contributors. And you're right, even if people may not look to Carl Sagan as a great kind of poet laureate of science, things affect other things, which affect still other things, and it may be that people who start out in the arts are themselves affected by the Carl Sagans and the Richard Dawkins, and take it to another level of artistry. But this is, by the way, just to this is not to downplay the fact that sheer rational argumentation can affect people, and because sometimes I'm sure you hear this and I hear it. Well, people are so irrational that rational arguments, they're just preaching to the choir. No one ever is persuaded by them. We know that that's false.
Absolutely. We know that from the last 10 years in the work that we've done as well with the Muslim world, that it's actually...
I actually want to touch on something Ali was asking. I just want to continue on that question because I think it was very important. The difference between Islam and Muslims. One thing we're very sensitive about, we want to use the word reform for Muslims, not for Islam. We think Islam is the source of bad ideas. Enlightenment values challenge that, and it's Muslims that reform. Muslims reform by moving away from Islam. But Islam will remain the source of bad ideas. It's true that Muslims might have contradictory ideas in their head, but everybody does. I mean, if we look inside us, we are all going to have some views which don't contradict each other. Maybe that we act like we're true to them, but we're actually not. So I just think like a Muslim or a Christian is more than just a Muslim or a Christian, and they have competing ideas in their head. And if they're reforming, it's not the Islam that has reformed. Islam is the bad part of their influence, and these other competing ideas. So just focusing on saying Muslims are reforming and not Islam, and because of other ideas, I think it's very important. And another thing is that I think the ex-Muslim movement, rather than the reform movement, has been a major influence in bringing these Enlightenment values not only to many thousands of Muslims that are leaving Islam, but also influencing Muslims that are ignoring Islam.
Interesting. I mean, you've obviously given a lot more thought to it, and so my question is just, what is and this is really almost like something that an advertising agency or the kind of people who put together focus groups worry about. Like, what is the most effective messaging? And I don't know the answer, and it may be that there are several answers because there are different subpopulations who respond to different kinds of messaging. Just the question is it going to are a lot of Muslims going to just react reflexively to the idea that Islam is the source of bad ideas, even if it is, as are the other Abrahamic religions.
The way I get their guards down is by saying, like, listen, if Islam is true, atheism is a very dangerous ideology. And I appreciate the fact that you're trying to bring us back to Islam because you're doing it out of sympathy. You're trying to save our soul, right? If Islam is true, atheism is a very dangerous ideology, and you should be fighting that. But so I understand you fighting atheism. So please also understand us that given we're not anti-Muslim. We're just the same way that you want to save, you like atheists, you have sympathy for atheists. That's why you're fighting atheism. So you can see that we're fighting Islam because we have sympathy for Muslims. Because in our view, even if we're wrong, the number one victims of Islam are Muslims, right?
Yeah, so that's a very important point.
And you mentioned that in your book as well.
Yeah, no, and that's part of the great tragedy of the slowness of Islam in reforming. But I guess my question is, even in the most secular parts of the West, there are a lot of people who just can't get the word atheist out of their throats. It's a word that I think irrational, but people they kind of, because of its connotation, its emotional coloring, right. To a lot of people it kind of feels like a moralist. That it's, I just don't care. I'm in it for myself. There's no higher principles. Now, of course, this is a fallacy, but even in countries that have, at least in part, undergone an enlightenment, atheism for a lot of people it's a bridge too far. It's just they just get so squeamish. So the question is, even though I completely agree with you that ultimately, for people who are logically consistent and ethically principled, you really don't want to get your morality from a non-existent supernatural entity. You don't need to. There's plenty of basis for morality. But in terms of just tactics, persuasion, I wonder whether people are ready for it yet, and whether kind of appealing to their benign hypocrisy, there might be a role for that as well.
Really quickly, Armin,
I don't know.
I'm going to respond to that after Ali.
I just wanted to mention a really quick thing, and I'll let Armin continue, is that one thing we've mentioned here before on this podcast is that I kind of, when you talk about approaches, I look at the civil rights movement and I see figures like Rosa Parks who acted in silence, just in silent protest. I'm not going to move to the back of the bus. You have Martin Luther King Jr., who was very conciliatory and he was diplomatic and he was more of a politician. Then you had Malcolm X, who was much more militant and in your face, and all of those approaches worked in their own place. And this is kind of interesting. This is one of the conversations that you're having, like what you're hearing Armin talk about, is a conversation that we're having within the Muslim community. So a lot of it is very it's very animated, it's very dynamic. I think it's something that hasn't really happened a lot before until just, I guess, the last 10, 15 years. So all of these approaches are in play, and there are different views as to what works, what doesn't work, what kind of terminology, what approaches work. So this is a conversation that we have that's
But
continuously. That's interesting.
In response to using the label atheist, the reason why I think we should use it is because people think atheists are immoral, because we want to show them otherwise. Just the same way people thought being gay was disgusting, and people think that maybe they should hide it is the most convenient way. But then more and more people came out as gay, and people met gay people, saw that they're not disgusting, saw that they're not evil, so then they become used to it and become
dehumanized.
They humanize it because they found out that their coworker, their friend, their boss, their daughter is gay, and became normal. And that's why I think we have to kind of own the name that is people demonized, so that we humanize it. This is the same strategy. The slut walk. They use the word slut because that's the word they use to insult them. So they use that word to make it and they own it. That's why I think
queer,
yes.
Which was originally pejorative, and and there are various versions of the N-word, niggas with attitude, usually spelled with an A as opposed to an ER.
Right.
But again, reclaimed, appropriated. So that's I think that's quite plausible. I think another side of it has to be. I think the three of us agree. Atheism kind of gets you to square one because it kind of removes an illicit source of belief. But of course, atheism by itself just is the absence of a belief. It isn't a positive commitment to what we ought to strive for. And that's why I think, and I assume that you both of you agree that humanism, Enlightenment values have to are essential in saying that if you're an atheist, doesn't mean you don't believe in anything.
Right.
There really is a totally coherent, defensible system of morality that just doesn't require God as the enforcer or as the dictator. Namely, we ought to maximize human well-being, life, health, education, happiness, freedom. That's not nothing. And what I try to argue in Enlightenment now is that the attempt to prioritize human well-being is, I don't want to say it's succeeded because a lot of the world is still in misery, but the world is really better off than it used to be as a result of our at least implicitly putting those values as our moral bedrock.
Right.
And when people say, well, the world will never agree on that. You've got every tribe has their own morality, and they're not going to, human flourishing is just too wispy and abstract and feel good. But that's not absolutely false, because if you look at things like Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the world signed on to it, including, I believe at the time, 7 Muslim majority nations, at a time in which a lot of Christian nations were dragging their feet. And the world only had a few dozen countries at the time. The Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, 178 nations signed on to them. The world really can agree that reducing poverty and hunger and illiteracy and violence are inspiring moral values that we can all get behind.
Right.
You mentioned something in your book. You mentioned root causes as a fallacy. Is that yeah. That was very interesting. Do you want to explain it a little bit before we ask a question about that? Or
yeah, I think obviously, especially me as a scientist, wants to get at the root of social phenomena, but I think a lot of intellectuals and commentators and editorialists are too confident that they know the root causes of a problem, and may be wrong. And even though they look down on treating the symptoms, a Band-Aid solution, a quick fix, sometimes we have to acknowledge that we're often so ignorant of the root causes that addressing the symptoms might be the best way of dealing with the phenomenon, given our ignorance. I'll just be concrete. Crime, violent crime, murder, rape, assault, all of them plummeted, most dramatically in the United States. Starting in 1992, the crime rate just fell in half in 8 years, and then continued to sink in the first decade of the 21st century. It came as a complete surprise. All of the experts were predicting it would go even higher. It was contrary to the most popular root cause theory among intellectuals, which is that you will never address crime until you solve the root causes of poverty and racism. Well, it turned out I don't think racism did a sudden nosedive from 1992 to 2000. Inequality increased; it didn't decrease during those decades, and so the attempt actually to bring crime down by bringing crime down by having more effective policing, by having better lighting and better locks and a number of other methods, succeeded in saving hundreds of thousands of lives. People who are walking the streets today who would have been murdered if the homicide rate had stayed the same. And everyone's favorite theory about the root causes turned out to be wrong.
Right. Do you think people are making a similar mistake when they're saying that humanity will never get rid of religion?
Quite possibly. Certainly the trend, the biggest trend in switches in religious affiliation is from religion to no religion. Now, that doesn't increase the number of believers and non-believers because believers have more babies than non-believers. So the number of agnostics and atheists and humanists has not been increasing. But then when people switch, that's the direction they tend to switch in. And so the question, it's possible, nonetheless, that even then the number of non-believers will increase because as countries get better educated and wealthier, their birth rates start to decline. And this is true of countries, this is true of ethnic groups within countries. So even the very high rate of reproduction of religious people might change as these religious communities get better educated and wealthier. And in a number of Muslim majority countries, the birth rate has fallen dramatically, despite predictions that it would persist forever.
Yeah, that's so interesting because you hear a lot of the far right rhetoric, and they're talking about how the Muslim world, everybody's breeding and it's going to be the biggest population, and you just think, okay, well, if you just help them get more economically independent and more sustainable, then you wouldn't have their birth rates will probably fall.
Yes, and things like together with education, together with women's empowerment, when women get control of their lives, they tend to have fewer babies, and that is, by the way, one of the biggest forces in changes in the Islamic world is that the progress towards women equality is probably unstoppable. It's really, as they say, an idea whose time has come, and we see it even in the most backward practices. Saudi women being allowed to drive. I mean, it's kind of a pretty pathetic accomplishment, but it did happen.
Yeah, it did happen, and we actually just a short announcement. We have Masih Alinejad, who's the author of The Wind in My Hair. She started the My Stealthy Freedom movement in Iran. She's going to be on the podcast tomorrow as well. So it'll be really interesting to bring up some of these issues with her. So I wanted to move on. I guess you talked about women's empowerment as well, and so I had a question about something that you wrote in your book that I found really interesting. You were talking about theoconservatives and how these are, and I guess this is relevant in light of the retirement of Justice Anthony Kennedy from the church, where the theoconservatives are horrified by a world that's changing for the better because of Enlightenment values. Correct me because I'm paraphrasing, so if I got any of this wrong, let me know. And they sort of want to return to the Judeo-Christian values that they think made society great at one time. So they want to counter evils, what they see as evils, like the welfare state, gay rights, women's emancipation, like abortion, and so on. You also mentioned how this is actually inflamed by radical Islam, but both are actually quite similar, since Islamic jihadists they're also reacting to a progressive world that is changing for the better, and they want to take it back to a time when there was, in their view, more order. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that parallel, and also, do you see these phenomena of the rise of Trumpism, far right populism, ethno-nationalism? Is this and jihadism as well? Is this a movement, an actual movement, or is it just a backlash?
Yeah, good question. So the term theoconservative originated by a writer named Damon Linker. It was a bit of a pun on neoconservative, which is the common name for the George W. Bush school. But yes, it is reactionary in the literal sense of wanting to wrench society backwards, deploring the changes that had taken place and believing that there was a kind of fall from a golden age. The theoconservatives believe that the whole Enlightenment was a mistake. They want to go back to the pre-modern and medieval church that laid down a set of rock-solid moral values instead of leaving it to feeble humans to decide. And there is a strange common cause with Islamic fundamentalism, to the point where some intellectuals like Dinesh D'Souza, recently in the news because Donald Trump pardoned him for campaign violations, but he wrote a book where he kind of said, well, you got to hand it to the radical Muslim extremists and fundamentalists. At least they're successfully diagnosed the decadence of modern society, and they have rock solid moral values, and so it's you got to hand that to them. So it's a funny coming together of enemies over the issue of wrenching society backwards and basing morality and politics on religion. So whether Trumpism and authoritarian populism and nationalism are the wave of the future or a backlash, I tend to think that it's a backlash. Say that cautiously because I also predicted that Donald Trump would never be elected president. So what I say,
you're not alone.
I know, right? There are a number, even though there are partly because it's bundled with issues that people feel very, very strongly about, like immigration. It's gotten a kind of a boost of popularity, but I think longer term trends push against it. One of them being urbanization. Trump supporters and Brexit supporters and European populist parties get their support from rural regions, and people are moving to cities. It's a generational phenomenon in part. It's older generations that support populism, millennials not so much. It's an education-driven phenomenon. People with more education tend to be less sympathetic to populism, and the world is getting more educated. And also, there are just some problems that are just so inherently global that the idea that we should just promote the interests of our nation in competition with other nations is just bound to bump up against reality. There are problems like climate change, like piracy, like terrorism, like rogue states, like nuclear proliferation, like pandemic, that are like cybercrime, where you just, out of your own self-interest, you're going to have to cooperate with other nations. And so that globalization force is going to push back against this nationalism. So how long it will take, if someone with at least I think of it as an optimistic view that this is not the wave of the future. We don't know, and I might be wrong, but at least there are some reasons to think that this is not the wave of the future.
Yeah, I actually tend to agree with you. I share your optimism as well, and I think that a lot of it had to do with when Barack Obama was elected and he was the first black president. There's this idea that, okay, everything's changed, everything's good now, this is a transformation towards the future. And then what happened afterwards, I think there was a realization, okay, we may have gotten a little bit too complacent, and this wasn't really a transformation. It was just a fragile first step towards, progressive change, and usually have 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But when you're in the moment, a backlash can seem like a movement.
Yeah.
So I had a question. I get a lot of people attacking me when I suggest this. So I wanted to see what you think. Do you think Christianity is responsible for any of the great values in the modern world, which some people refer to as Western values?
Well, Western, it was almost hard to tell them apart because the West was just so almost entirely Christian that they're like almost perfectly confounded. In terms of the actual content of Christianity, there are probably a couple of ideas. The idea of of universal value of human life. But for example, the ancient Greeks, for all of their enlightened values and all of their brilliance, didn't really have that as a concept. They have the idea that here, and I get a lot of this from my other half, Rebecca Goldstein, who's the author of Plato at the Googleplex and 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, a work of fiction, and other atheist humanist works. So we're fellow humanists. But she emphasized that the Greeks really had the idea that what really counted was heroic accomplishment. There are the immortals, the people who achieve fame by feats of artistic or martial greatness. And everyone else can kind of go to hell, but not in those words. So Christianity did have an idea of intermittently respected of universal human value. There's also another thread was the idea of forswearing revenge, turning the other cheek. Most cultures have the idea of manly defense of honor and the moral imperative of avenging all attacks and insults as almost a sacred value, simply because in a world of anarchy, that was the only way that you don't get annihilated, is if other people think that you're so tough, you're such a badass that you're going to retaliate if you cross them, then they'll think twice about getting in your face. So it's kind of a primitive form of justice. And Jesus, by forswearing that, introduced an idea that was, I assume, radical for its time. Again, really not particularly well embraced, but at least it was out there. It was thrown out into the meme pool.
But I don't see. I'm not sure if I follow, because we're talking about a book that suggests that I don't know how much it values the three of our lives, given that we would be burning forever in the eternal lakes of fire.
What is that?
Yeah, I mean, it tells you the value of life. There are a whole list of people that are supposed to get killed and die based on both the Old Testament. I mean, and the New Testament was revolutionary and in the idea of suggesting eternal torture. Even the Old Testament was not as brutal as suggesting unending pain. So I don't buy into the fact that was the new idea that suggests. I mean, I know the Greek philosophers, when it comes to their ethics, they weren't perfect, but they were a lot more nuanced and detailed, and a lot more. I mean, any good values that we can even find in the Christianity doesn't come with a rational argument behind it. It was just lucky that it was good. The Greek philosophers, when they come up with values, even the bad ones, at least the reason why they told people should adopt them is because of the logic they had behind them. Sometimes they had bad logic. So I think the process was more important than the conclusion, because the conclusion, even if it happens to be good by luck, if is promoting a way of getting to it by the revelation, by faith, that could get you to some other many horrible conclusions if you use them. Don't you think?
No, I think those are all excellent points. I was being charitable as to what the contributions were, and any religion, especially one that has a big sprawling book of scriptures, is going to have a bunch of ideas mutually contradictory. So it's a question of, are there any ideas in there that you could kind of pick out like cherries out of a pie that would then be upvoted and some of the other ones downvoted over the course of time.
So the picking method becomes more important than what we're picking, right? The method becomes more important. And what the Bible does is suggest that divine revelation or faith is the method. So the method, so what the screening criteria is more important than what we get at. Because even if we get to something good, it was just an accident because the method was flawed.
Well, you said it very well. I just cannot disagree with that.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to get to. We have some our patrons are on our live chat. So one of them has asked a question. It's Genesis Gnosis. He's saying, do you think there's a difference between men and women when it comes to leaving or subscribing to dogma? And I guess this is I find this an interesting question, because we have seen that a lot of times in the secular movement, we do get a lot of support from men, and the ratio of men to women is pretty skewed. So have you seen that, and do you have any explanations for it? Or
yeah, there is. It's like a number of gender differences. Some gender differences are huge. A lot of them are differences in the average with lots of overlap. And I suspect that this is one where there is a gender difference in the average, but with tremendous overlap. And you're right that men tend to be more likely to be atheists than women. Again, this is one of those generalizations that is an average with lots of exceptions in both directions. We don't really know the reason. One is that on average, men tend to be more led by purely abstract arguments, that whereas women are more affected by a kind of totality of ideas and embedded in a social network. Men tend to be more nerdy, more autistic. Women tend to be more empathic, more socially connected. And so if you think of all of the things that pull people around, especially the vast majority of people who aren't particularly intellectual in the first place, you can see a little bit of a difference emerging that way. I think men are also more, since men are nowadays, saying I'm an atheist, there's a little bit of an in-your-face aspect to that, given how squeamish people are about the concept of atheism. And so if there's a difference in dominance and aggression, that would tilt it in the favor of men as opposed to being embedded in a community. But again, since you have mentioned several women who are part of your movement, and there are others like Sarah Haider, I'm married to one of the country's most prominent humanist atheists. We're going to be careful of making any generalizations that would make it seem as if it's all men on one side, all women on the other, which it most definitely is not.
Yeah, I have one of the things that specifically with the ex-Muslim movement that we've seen is that it is what the women take on is a lot more severe than what the men take on. So, for instance, my wife is also a secular activist, and the kind of threats that she gets, like when we get violent or death threats, I'll generally. People will tell me that, okay, if you ever set foot in Pakistan again, we're going to kill you. But with her, they're always sexualized, they're always rape threats. And that there's another aspect to this, that when women leave religion, or specifically in Islam, but I think other religions as well, there's this idea that they are no longer moral, they are loose charactered, you can kind of do anything with them. And sometimes people even in the Muslim world especially, many of the women, the criticism they get is like, well, you left Islam because you wanted to be more promiscuous, or you wanted to drink more alcohol. So I think that probably is also
that's a good point. And so maybe the
impediment.
Women may just face greater intimidation. So that may be yet another reason.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Armin, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think as I was reading your book, I came to I have an appreciation for science and Enlightenment values, but the more I read your book, the more I realized that I should appreciate it 10 times as much as I used to. But as I was reading it, I was thinking, I always had this assumption that, religion and other bad ideas, the major cost they have to humanity is even more subtle, because most people think about like suicide bombing or child molestation by priests. But I'm thinking maybe the greatest cost is taking resources and attention away from Enlightenment values, from science. I mean, how many potential scientists were made to memorize the Quran or become experts in fiqh or go to religious Christian schooling? The potentials that are lost that we might never known, the decisions in politics and by other major decision makers that are made based on religion, based on faith, that could have maybe completely changed the direction of humanity for better if they were making it based on rational thought. These things that are not headline worthy might have cost us a lot more than anything that we notice on the news. What do you think about that?
No, interesting. There is the question of kind of allocation of intellectual capital. What do smart people do with their time, or do for a living? And also a relevant example is in the history of Judaism, where when Jews were emancipated in the starting in the 19th century, there was this floodgates open in terms of entry of Jews into science and philosophy and other intellectual pursuits, which probably for centuries was allocated to disputation of passages in the Talmud. A lot of it probably at a very high intellectual level, but to very, very, very little productive effect ultimately. And that was probably also true of Jesuits, also kind of an intellectualized religious sect. And I suspect that that's true, that there's an enormous amount of brain power in the Islamic world that's waiting to be released to scientific pursuits.
All right, we have more Patreon questions. Can I ask one of them?
Yeah, please go ahead.
So this one was long. This one was left by a patron on our YouTube channel, but I'm just going to summarize it because it's way too long. So this person was suggesting that right now the competing ideas are Islam, regressive leftism, some other ethno-nationalism, and Christianity. And atheists make the mistake that you could just remove all of this and there's going to be a void that you can't fill. So they say, like, given all these options, we should maybe Christianity is the best option because they're all the other ones are really terrible. So we should just be backing the least damaging one because you can't, because the void is just not going to be. We don't understand how these ideas, how these religions, how faith, how a greater sense of meaning, something transcendent, how much people need this. And until we come up with something better, Christianity is our best option.
Yeah, I don't. I don't agree. Although we do need to boost the both emotional appeal and the intellectual awareness of humanist movements that aren't necessarily called humanist movements. Yeah. They go by many names. I don't know if humanism is the best label. I think I've advocated it. But just as an example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and before that, the Millennium Development Goals. Now, it sounds kind of bureaucratic and nerdy, but on the other hand, you're raising hundreds of millions of people out of starvation and poverty and disease. I mean, that should be uplifting.
But it's not for some reason.
But for some reason it's not. And I think it can be made if we had the right combination of ideas and inspiring speakers, writers, artists. There are gatherings in which you feel the emotional appeal of of the Enlightenment project. I think Obama was very good at doing it, and he wove a little bit of Christianity into it, but it wasn't fundamentally Christian. It was really humanistic.
I think, U.S. presidents, I think, generally have to some extent.
Yeah, they can't. For sheer political survival, they can't just totally discard it. But Obama did downplay it. Now we've gotten the exact opposite in the current president, who is doing his best to undermine international understandings, international global consciousness that there is uplifting, exciting possibilities for improvement by dealing with things at a global scale, considering all humans as equally worthy, and the improvement of human well-being being a coherent goal. And there was a time, I think, there was a time in which even like the United Nations, which has been tainted in a number of ways, but it was thought of almost as a kind of humanistic secular religion, and in some ways, parts of it at least can still serve that purpose.
I think maybe religion is responsible for why we haven't been able to create awe in this area, because they have monopolized community and awe inspiration. So the fact that people think that they are the source of it, and they are responsible for stealing it. And I think maybe we should compete with them in art, and because we haven't been celebrating these values the way they have celebrated their values. Like I don't know, like I looked at the list that you put in your book, the number of the scientists and the number of people they saved. I can't think any religious idea ever contributing. Like you have a list in your book that's the name of the scientists and the discovery and the lives that they saved. That's I tweeted that list. And maybe we could make statues of these people and build like a temple-like thing around each one of them.
Idolatry.
No,
like benign idolatry.
I know.
It would be based on facts. Like if the ones that is penicillin, we could make this theme of the temple based on eradicating disease. The one that is water, we could make a temple that is the theme is based on water. Like we could have there's some way to make music.
There is.
Yeah,
it's happening a little bit in phenomena like TED, where there are TED Talks where if you're actually present, you almost feel a kind of religious warmth and glow when someone talks about eradicating disease or a new method of carbon capture or a new way of reducing homelessness. You can almost feel it in the crowd. This people aren't literally in tears, but they're kind of in that direction. And if we had accomplishments that, like reduction of poverty, that were better known, that could add some emotional energy behind the Enlightenment values that we are trying to advocate on intellectual grounds. You also see it a little bit in the turnaround of the reputation of Bill Gates. In his Microsoft days, he was kind of a hated figure. There were I Hate Gates websites. Now, deservedly, he's not quite a secular saint, but he is listed as one of the world's most admired people. And he and Melinda Gates, I think they don't have big egos. They haven't made themselves centers of a cult figure, but they appear in photos with children from the developing world that give a positive emotional response.
Yeah, they're acting by example.
Acting by example. Another example is Nobel Peace Prizes, which sometimes go to literal peacemakers like Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia, but also go to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who helped bring peace to West Africa, Malala Yousafzai, Kailash Satyarthi, who has reduced child labor and child slavery. So the Nobel Peace Prize is another kind of secular substitute for religious iconography. We may need a lot of these secular equivalents where we try to engage people's moral sentiments, moral fervor toward causes that we can actually defend on Enlightenment principles, like life is better than death and peace is better than war and abundance is better than poverty.
But okay, Ali, do you want to...
Oh yeah, I was going to say that we just have a couple of minutes left, so we want to be mindful of your time. I wanted to ask just two last quick questions. One is there is this idea that when they talk about Christianity and Islam, overall in the world, there's terrorism. There's the whole threat of terrorism and jihad, and then there's the problem of faith itself, the idea of believing things without evidence, and that is common to all religions. Do you think that when we focus too much on terrorism or on Islamic terrorism, do you think that we may just be focusing on the periphery and the real problem is at the core? Because I mean, in your book, you actually talk about Enlightenment values and how that really is what we should be pushing for, and that may be addressing everything together. I don't know if I was very articulate there, but
yeah, no, there is kind of part of the expression, kind of faith as a kind of root cause.
Yeah.
And if you believe that martyrs are rewarded in an afterlife, for example, that's a pretty toxic idea.
Yeah.
And so, making that proposition seem kind of incredible, unbelievable, archaic is part of the answer to fighting terrorism. Not the only one. But by the way, speaking of false root causes, the idea that that poverty is a cause of terrorism is another false root cause.
Oh yeah. We know that. I mean, with all of go ahead.
But going back to evidence-based discussions of social and political phenomena, the fact that terrorism is an unsuccessful tactic, that is, terrorists don't get what they want in the vast majority of cases. If that fact were out there, that would go, I think, part of the way toward reducing the appeal of terrorism. And another would be if the news media did not devote such saturation coverage to terrorist acts, therefore giving them exactly what they see, which is publicity, terror.
Yeah. And finally, we just have 2 minutes left, so just a really quick question. You talked a little bit about tribalism in your book, and you're also a photographer. And I think you mentioned, and this is something that my wife would be very interested in too, because she's a photographer as well. Nikon or Canon?
I've now switched to Leica, which means that I have more money than sense.
Oh, you're a maverick. Okay.
It's a bit of a maverick, and it's beautiful stuff. It's a little bit archaic in some ways, but it makes it a very pleasurable experience for me.
Yeah. And what did you switch from? What did you use?
Canon.
You were from Canon.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So hopefully that doesn't start too many more wars. There. But Stephen, thank you so much for being here. I mean, we really enjoyed this. We could go on for hours.
Yeah,
but
I have like a million other questions.
Well, we'll do it. We'll do it again at some point.
And,
thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for writing the book. It really is. I think it's something that's sorely needed, especially nowadays when everybody thinks that the world is going to hell. And when we look at trend lines versus headlines, I mean, it makes all the difference. And I think that having the big picture in mind, the way that you have, is just really, really helpful, and I couldn't recommend the book enough.
Yeah.
And thank you for your support of all of us as well, and everything that we're doing.
And I think that one of the best ways to celebrate these Enlightenment values is to actually go read this Enlightenment Now book. I think I think I have a much better perspective of how much I'm indebted to these people that are behind these ideas and behind these discoveries. So thank you so much for that book as well.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for a very stimulating and enjoyable conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks you.